Good morning, everyone. My name is Jan Narasimhan, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of Beroe, I would like to welcome you all to another webinar from Beroe Insights. In today's webinar, we will have our presenter discuss the feasibility of container freight as a competitive alternative to air shipments. So before we move ahead with the presentation, I have a few general set of instructions as always. Please note that all attendees will be placed on mute. During the course of the presentation, if you would like to post questions, you will find a box on the right-hand side indicated in red. I request you to type in your question and hit the send button. As the presentation progresses, I will note down the high-frequency questions and pose it to the presenter at the end of the session. If you experience any connectivity issues, I request you to close the window, go back to the email and try to reconnect using the same link. If there are further problems, please do not hesitate to email Puneet at puneet.ramal@beroe-inc.com. You can also find it in the email shared with you earlier. Moving on, let me quickly introduce our presenter for today's webinar. Syed Abuzair is a logistics expert at Beroe Inc. He specializes in ocean freight category, providing procurement-related intelligence and solutions to Fortune 500 companies. In his 3 years at Beroe, Syed has built extensive knowledge and expertise in transportation categories for the end-use markets such as pharmaceuticals and consumer packaged goods, among others. He has also written and published several thought leadership papers in leading cold chain and other logistics magazines. Some of the topics he has covered in his papers include savings potential by reevaluating logistics engagement with our inbound suppliers and index-linked contracts for ocean freight. So without further ado, let me pass it on to Syed.
Thank you, Jenny. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Logistics over a period of time has become strategic than tactical, especially for pharmaceutical manufacturers. Every strategy is aimed towards making the company not just profitable, but also greener. When it comes to pharmaceutical industry, in terms of logistics, conventionally, companies use air freight for their overseas logistics requirements. Despite being cost intensive than other modes, logistics sourcing professionals operate with multiple constraints such as lead time, cargo damages, safety and reliability concerns, which force them to opt air freight over other modes. However, today we will see how the sourcing professionals could leverage ocean freight as a cost-effective alternative with minimal compromise. The question that arises now is how feasible is container freight as a competitive alternative to pharmaceutical air shipments. Let's first look at the problem statement, the issue which procurement is constantly facing. Pharmaceutical companies' spend on logistics is increasing as they launch new products, enter new markets, target more customers, and expand their sourcing geographies. In 2014, the estimated spend is approximately 4% for best-in-class companies, whereas median companies spend a lot higher. However, if the industry paces in similar fashion, the estimation is expected to look like this. What do we see here? Logistics spend is going to increase exponentially to 9%. Now the question is, how do we control this spend? And that's our topic for today. Savings opportunities by shifting a part of cargo from air freight to ocean. Let's look at the agenda for today's webinar. We will cover the topic in 3 important segments. First and foremost, if we shift towards ocean containerized cargo, how much of savings could be realized? Secondly, how do we implement this shift? Finally, concluding this webinar by highlighting the must-know parameters one should keep in mind while implementing the shift. It is important to answer the most basic question of why. Why do we need to make this shift? Why do the sourcing professionals need to invest their time in such initiatives? As we see, the two most important reasons, internal cost pressure and staying competitive in the industry. By the end of this webinar, we hope to gain ideas on how sourcing professionals could achieve about 70% of cost reduction. But that's not it. The shift would also result in significant reduction in terms of carbon emissions, which is estimated to be about 50%. So the benefits are evident. But then, does the industry reflect the same? Let's look at some statistics. I have analyzed average spend across 4 major industries: FMCG, food and beverage, consumer electronics, and pharmaceutical. Let's focus on the red blocks. We see that pharmaceutical industry has a very minimal spend on ocean freight, and this is the segment for our focus today. Based on my estimates, the current shipment split looks like this, where the air freight takes the major chunk of shipments, and the other two modes contributing only 15%. However, for further savings and cost optimization through ocean freight, the desired split which the sourcing manager should aspire looks something like this, where a part of air freight volume is shifted to ocean. But then, does this mean that we prefer ocean freight over air? Let's have a simple comparison of cost and time between the two modes. Here I have taken an example of shipment originating from China to mainland US across 3 different services. First, air freight. Second, preferred LCL, that is preferred less than container load. And standard LCL. Let's take the cost first. We would be incurring around $6,000 for the entire cargo movement through air freight. Whereas with preferred LCL, the cost is only about $1,700. However, in terms of time, when we compare air freight and preferred LCL, we see that additional time has to be factored in. To summarize, we see a cost reduction of about 70%. However, nothing comes free. The disadvantage is we will have to accommodate additional transit time of about 12 days. Therefore, we can conclude that not all product types can undergo the shift. Now that we know what the benefits are, we must look at how effectively to implement this shift. Every initiative requires cautious approach. As mentioned earlier, we will now look at the 4 different must-know aspects. First, the right cargo selection. Second, the right lanes. Third, right partners, that is the right service provider with right technology. Then the last and the most important aspect of insurance. Now let's see each of these aspects one by one. Firstly, right cargo selection. There are certain limitations in terms of cargo selection. Let's look at it in more detail. Currently, non-critical cargo could be grouped into powders form, liquid compositions, tablets, non-time sensitive vaccines. These products are feasible for ocean freight adoption, as it is supported by lanes and have longer shelf life. Whereas critical product groups such as blood plasma products, liquid APIs, that is active pharmaceutical ingredients, and biologics, which are the core R&D related products of pharmaceutical companies, still are predominantly carried through air freight, and we see no change in the mode of transportation. Therefore, based on the product type, from this slide we can derive that only non-critical products are feasible for containerized cargo. Now the next step is to understand the right logistics partner and the technological availability. Not all service providers are capable of offering tailored services, which is a critical requirement for pharma logistics. Unavailability of suitable technology limits supplier options. Let's evaluate the available technology. I have mapped them under adoption and cost parameter. First is manual, where the monitoring and control is done by designated person who checks on temperature fluctuations on regular time interval. Secondly, onboard system, where the automated control and monitoring system is installed within the vessel. Thirdly, remote monitoring, wherein the shipper will have direct monitoring of the temperature movements. However, this technology is very expensive, hence the low adoption of the same. Based on the adoption and the cost incurred, we could conclude that most important parameter for service provider evaluation would be onboard monitoring and control. And also that onboard system is the preferred method for pharmaceutical ocean cargo. We now know the product type and the ideal service provider. Next logical step would be evaluating the lane availability. Here I have considered 3 factors for evaluating lanes. On the left y-axis is the reefer capacity availability. On the x-axis is the route maturity, or the traffic in terms of how many containers move as part of pharmaceutical shipments. And finally, technological suitability, which is defined by the availability of infrastructural support. Let's look into the lanes one by one. First onto my list is North America to Europe, which scores close to high on all 3 factors, that is, reefer capacity, route maturity, and technological suitability. And it is highly supportive for pharmaceutical requirements due to its shorter distance and closer proximity. Next onto my list is Europe to Latin America, which scores close to high on all 3 factors. This is predominantly due to the heavy movement of perishables from Latin America. Third onto my list is Europe Middle East. It has gained its significance due to short distance and proximity between the regions. Finally, Asia North America. This lane for standard cargo is highly mature. However, for reefer trade, it scores medium to low. An important aspect to keep in mind is to select the route which has minimal transshipment, as it extends the transit time. From this slide, we can conclude that only limited number of lanes can adopt the shift. Before going into the aspect of insurance, let's take a step backwards and understand where we are actually cutting cost. Where are we actually saving? Going to the previously used example of China to mainland US, I have tried breaking down the cost components of air freight in terms of fuel, packaging, handling charges, and other admin related charges. Finally, we arrive at $1,700 for preferred LCS. Let's go one more step deeper to break down the $1,700 as well. First comes fuel cost, that is the bunker fuel, which contributes about 35% of the total cost incurred. Second is the fixed cost, which is in terms of vessel operations and leasing. Thirdly, the container and terminal handling related cost, which will be higher as we are talking about reefer containers. And the last, and of course, is the admin cost. Comparing these two, what do we observe? We have a cost reduction opportunity of about 70%. We understand the savings, and it is good to have such estimations. But then, how do we ensure that nothing goes wrong in transit? That's when insurance comes into picture. We must have a tri-party arrangement in ocean freight. Since predominant practice is to insure cargo based on weight rather than value, it is imperative that insurance contract must revolve around value rather than the weight. Between manufacturer and liner, it is important to define the service levels and setting KPIs to ensure the quality of service. Secondly, between manufacturer and insurance company, one must define liability sharing. Now that we have taken care of insurance factors, let's analyze the risk and how to mitigate them. Here in our case, I've categorized them into 2 buckets, financial and non-financial. First is increased transit time. That's the first concern we must address if we move to ocean freight. However, the concern can be addressed by choosing the right category of products with longer shelf life. Second, increased inventory. Here the manufacturer needs to conduct an opportunity analysis to compare savings from transportation mode shift vis-a-vis increased inventory cost and take a judgment call based on the results. And the second bucket of non-financial, the first issue evolves is port issues, which is a major challenge. It can be addressed by choosing direct services. Then the frequency of departures, which may not match with the manufacturer's shipping schedule. For this, freight forwarders have come up with tailored services that are tuned to match manufacturer's requirement. Finally, there is also a risk on the technological front, where the manufacturer might lose contact with the ship. This can be resolved if the service provider has appropriate technology. Now that we know what products could be chosen, what are the feasible lanes, ideal service provider, and the various risks involved, the question arises if anyone has made the shift in the industry. Are there lanes which are in practice for? Yes, it is. I've plotted the lanes which are in practice. First, the major sea route prevalent in the ocean segment. Here we notice the proximity in sea routes between transatlantic and Europe to Middle East. Companies are leveraging this proximity, and even critical shipments are being shipped through ocean freight. However, it is on a very niche scale. But our major concentration, which is non-critical shipments, is followed on Europe outbound, Asia outbound, and even Australia-related routes. Now let's see an example of a leading pharma company. The companies involved were a leading pharmaceutical manufacturer and a 3PL, who together took the challenge of migrating cargo from air to ocean freight. The criteria which they used were non-critical shipments with longer shelf life, and only developed region lanes were considered. An important aspect which they kept in mind was no transshipment. Then they considered quite a lot of regions based on some same factors which we discussed earlier with respect to capacity, maturity, traffic, that is traffic, and infrastructural support. Based on their volume movements, they arrived at choosing US to Europe and the trade loop between Japan, Singapore, and Australia. Challenges which they faced were carrier selection with appropriate technology and service levels, drafting insurance terms, and direct service schedules, which were tailored to suit their requirements. And what did they save? They saved around 55% of lane logistics cost, on top of 90% reduction in CO2 emissions. Now we are clear that it is feasible to shift a part of pharma cargo to ocean freight. However, it would depend on the risk appetite of the organization and the willingness to take innovative steps. To summarize and conclude, I have devised 4 right steps. First, right product selection. Second is the right partners, that is the right service providers with the right technology in place. And third is choosing the right lane. And fourth, connecting all 3, the right contracts. If we can bring right combination within the organization, the sourcing professional would certainly counter the increasing logistics cost. And that concludes our webinar, and thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Syed. I think we do have a couple of questions, and I'll start off with a question that more than one participant have asked. So let's move on to the first question. The question is, we've compared air and ocean freight on cost and time parameters. How have we arrived at the lead times? Does it include the entire lead time, or are we talking about port-to-port duration? I think that's slide number 6, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, Jayani, that is slide number 6. Thanks for asking that. The example which I have taken is from Shanghai, China to Dallas, that is mainland US. And I've calculated the entire lead time, which include origin country inland haulage, port-to-port voyage, and finally destination country haulage. I've also taken into consideration the average delays which might be caused due to port congestions, loading and unloading, etc.
The next question that we have is, how soon could we see emerging markets adopting ocean freight for pharmaceutical shipments?
Okay, that's an interesting question. To answer the question, I must first provide a brief on how long the transition will actually take. From my research, I understand that the transition take anywhere between 8 to 14 months. This is mainly for companies which are implementing such transition for the first time. Once the companies have tried the initiative in their strong markets, then replicating the same into emerging markets or any other region uh, would essentially boil down to just selecting the right partners and creating an arrangement between them.
I think we have time for one more question. What are the challenges could sourcing professionals anticipate if they choose other than the 4 lanes that's mentioned in your presentation? For example, lanes connecting Africa.
Okay. This question can be answered in 2 parts. The first challenge would be related to infrastructural support, and second would be service availability for reefer cargo specifically. In terms of infrastructural support, Africa has a limited number of ports which could support the power requirements that influence the temperature fluctuations for reefer containers. For example, South Africa, the most developed country in the region, has only 2 ports, Port of Durban and to a certain extent Port of Elizabeth, which supports reefer cargo movements on a large scale. With respect to the second part of the answer, that is service availability for reefer cargo, or how many liners currently offer services inbound or outbound to Africa. Currently, there are very limited number of service providers who offer services related to reefer. Therefore, the prime requirement of tailored pharmaceutical shipments cannot be met, and hence restricting the adoption of ocean freight in Africa-related trade.
Thanks, Syed. That wraps our presentation today. Many thanks for joining in. I hope you had an interesting webinar. Thank you very much.